Testing, yes. I'm so thirsty.
Are you kidding? 5 women?
It's gonna push me onto something that I
Because her
am not.
daughter's going to different.
I feel like over here I'm a little bit blinded. Just gonna shift a bit.
6 of them, the 5 women. I'll stay at home and
Okay. Well, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll get started. I'm so thrilled that everybody has come back. That's always encouraging. You could have just been polite last time. So now I know. Come on in. Not a problem. Name tags are over there if you want to make yourself a fashionable sticker. So this is session 2 of How Jesus Changed History. And so I'll just give a brief rundown of what we went through last week just to set the scene, and then we'll start looking into a few more categories of just how faith in Christ has influenced and shaped the world that we live in. So last week we talked about how we had this idea of a pair of spectacles, a pair of glasses, that everybody puts on a pair of glasses, and that is a set of beliefs that we call a worldview. And depending on what beliefs are within that pair of glasses, that influences how you understand the world. So we are coming at this from a Christian perspective, and so our worldview is shaped by the scriptures, by God's revelation in the Bible. And so we talked about 3 basic categories that we use to look at the universe. So the first one is God. What we believe about God, who God is, what his character is like, what his essence, what his nature is like. What we believe about God influences how we look on the world. What are the other 2 categories?
Man.
Yeah, man is the second one.
Mankind.
Yes. But and I'm left-handed and I'm already smearing. So I'll just leave it at that. Understanding is generic. But yeah, how we view humanity, the nature of who we are, our mental capacities, our physical capacities, our moral capacities. So what we think about ourselves influences the sorts of culture and civilization that we create. And the third category is the universe, yeah. Because we have humans here, but of course we need to have a context. We're not just floating off in the ether, but we need to have an actual setting that we're embedded in. So what we believe about God, what we believe about man, and what we believe about the universe, that forms our pair of spectacles. Ta-da! That influence how we look on the world. And so we talked last week just briefly about a couple of different ways of looking at human beings. One idea was the sense that we're basically all on a level playing field, we're all kind of equal, and we're all running a race. We're all going in the same direction, and given enough time, everybody is going to get from point A to point B eventually. So point A being a very primitive subsistence level society, all the way up to a very sophisticated society. So that's one way of perceiving the world, that we're basically it just takes time. But we also talked about a second way of viewing the world and human development, and that was this idea of silos, like a grain silo on a farm. And so we have certain people living in one, and certain people living here, and certain people living in these. And these silos, this is the set of beliefs that that particular culture has. And so their development is influenced and even limited by this set of beliefs. So you might have one particular people group, and they'll develop their culture as far as they can within their silo. But eventually they're gonna bump up against their own beliefs. And so when that happens, they're not going to be able to get out of it because that's just what they believe about the world. And so we touched on science last week, the idea that you can explore and understand the universe and you can manipulate it to a certain extent for your own benefit. Some people have the idea that mankind is capable of understanding the universe and that the universe can be understood. So if we have those beliefs, then we can kind of continue along this path of science and we're not inhibited by our spectacles. But if we're a people group that believes that humanity is not really capable of understanding the universe, and we looked at in Islam, in Islamic traditional thinking, that's where they're coming at it from, that mankind just doesn't quite have the capacity. Or if you believe that the universe is just too complicated or it's a mystery, and we looked briefly at Chinese traditional thinking that the universe, it's just there and nobody really knows why. If you have those sorts of beliefs, then you're not going to be able to, for example, develop science because you don't think that it can be done. You don't think that it should be done. There's nothing to tell you, hey, let's go down this path of exploration. So you're stuck in your silo. And because of these beliefs, you're not going to break through. And so that was one of the examples that we used of how a culture's spectacles, their beliefs about these three things can influence them. And so our point with all of this is to demonstrate how the Christian worldview provides the beliefs about these three things that are necessary for people to, if they were caught in this, to break out. So that's, again, the title of this, How Jesus Changed History. Because without Jesus coming into the world, Jesus is God's revelation, his direct revelation to us. He has come down, the Word became flesh. He is all part of the program of God revealing himself to us. So if you took Jesus, the incarnate Jesus, out of history, and all of the revelation that came before it, because all of that revelation is building up to Jesus coming the first time, which is building on Jesus then coming the second time. If you take that all out, if you just had mankind in the universe, if God just created and then walked away, we would have people stuck in our silos with our various beliefs about these things. And we talked about in Romans and the fall of man, what exactly is the fall of man? What's the problem there that we talked about in Romans? Do you happen to remember?
They suppress the truth.
Yes. So if we're on the premise that God does exist and he did create, so if that is true, but people are in rebellion against God, then they suppress the truth. So then they remain stuck in with whatever substitute beliefs they have here. So instead of the eternal, triune, omnipotent, omniscient, etc. sort of God, what sort of substitutes do people come up with?
Laws.
Laws, as opposed to like a person, but now there's just laws. Like in Chinese thinking where it's the Tao, it's kind of an essence. There's no person there.
Like I'm thinking of today, right? God emphatically tells us what he thinks of homosexuality, right? But in today's society, you can't speak anything against the gay movement or anything because we have laws saying that we have to be inclusive and all this other stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure, that does come into it. But when we talk specifically about God, if we believe, in the triune, omnipotent, omniscient God, but people are suppressing the truth about that, what sort of ideas do they come up to substitute for this particular God?
They create God in their image.
Yes, so give me some examples.
Objects.
Objects,
Like Buddhas or
worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. Polytheism is a prime example of that. People, they see objects, they see the sun and the moon and the stars, and they bow down and worship. And God, throughout the Old Testament, is warning people, don't do that. You're likely to do that because, oh, wow, it's the universe, and it's awe-inspiring. So, of course, you're going to be tempted to bow down and worship it. If you're suppressing the truth about the true God, you have to come up with something else. So people have worshipped, that's where astrology comes from, is just worshiping the heavens. So people will come up with other ideas of God, lesser beings that are not capable of creating and sustaining a universe where science is possible. Because if you have all these lesser petty gods, they don't have the power that is necessary to uphold a universe, to create a universe. So you're not even going to think about doing science because you have these petty gods that you're trying to appease. So we suppress the truth about God. We come up with lesser gods, no gods, anything we'll worship and give our time to other than this. What about man here? When we suppress the truth about man being created in God's image, what sort of images of humanity do we come up with?
Humanistic approach is secularism.
Yeah, it's very focused on us. That was a thought that came out of the Enlightenment, that man is the measure of all things. Basically, they're saying, like, mankind on his own, on our own, is enough to determine what's right and wrong, and to kind of create our own morality. But this is a lesser view of man. This is not given, because we are created in God's image. We are subordinate to God. So anytime we create an idea of man that puts us out of our place, we're going to run into certain problems. And we come up with, as you mentioned with the issues of sexuality. If we're not going to God, okay, God, you're the creator. What is your intention with sexuality? When we reject that, then we have to come up with our own ideas about sexuality. And in our current stage, we look to ourselves. Well, I can decide how I use my body. I can decide, hey, I don't like this body. I'm going to have surgery to, change my shape, to change my organs and whatnot, and I'll become a different gender if I want, because I can do that. Because your idea of man is not consonant with what is actually real, what is actual reality. And then the universe, when we suppress the truth about the universe, we come up with other sorts of ideas as well. We think, okay, well, the universe the way it is, if I look at it, I might imagine that it created itself. That just the natural laws that I see, gravity and electromagnetism and the nuclear forces and things like that, give them enough time, if they work together, they can create the universe. So you have an idea of the universe that just created itself. But that's suppressing the truth, because we know in Scripture that God, the omnipotent creator, has created the universe to run by laws. So at any rate, that's kind of a recap of what we're trying to get at here, is that there is a true way to understand the world. And when we have that truth, when we don't suppress the truth, but we go with it, when we paddle with the current, if we happen to be stuck in a silo of lies, we are able to escape. And we are able to come to the truth. And our civilization is able to flourish once the truth comes to it. But without it, then we are just going to stay in our silos. So we talked a little bit, we mentioned with Islam and China for science. We didn't get to universities, but we run into the same problem there. I'm just going to take a drink of water because I'm just so breathless right now. But we have quite a bit of information to cover tonight, so we won't get into the universities. What I want to start talking with is one point that Sarah made last week when I was asking, okay, well, why might societies not go down the path of science? And she pointed out, well, if you're just, trying to survive, you're just subsistence level and you're just trying to get through your day, you don't have the leisure to go and study, the heavens or anything like that, because you're just trying to get something to eat. And that's a very valid point. So if I wanted to pursue science, I would need to have a certain type of environment in which I would be able to do that. So we're going to start by talking about human rights, because how you think about humanity is going to dictate how you treat one another. And if you have a certain vision of humanity that isn't very respectful, that might makes right, then you're just, the powerful will just lord it over the people who don't have power, and they'll just be focused on accumulating wealth and accumulating more power, and they won't be too concerned about developing or whatnot. And the rest of the people that they are governing won't have any choice, like they'll just be trying to survive. So we'll see how Christ has invaded history to bring about freedom. It's all about freedom for the individual. So when we go back in history to ancient times, think of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, those sorts of cultures. They had very despotic sorts of governments. And so there wasn't much freedom for the average person. The concept of humans having rights never crossed their minds. Why? Because they were polytheists. So here's some of the ancient Mesopotamian gods. Their conception of the gods was that, there's a supreme god, and then there's, gods underneath. And so there's a bit of a hierarchy there, but there's not that sense of there's one god who has all the power. The power is kind of distributed amongst the gods. And so there's the superior god, and then he has the lesser gods to do the work, to do like the menial labor. Because these ancient people, they make God in their own image. So they're like, we have to work, to get food and stuff, so the gods must have to work too. So that's how they thought of the gods. So what happened in their thinking, in their mythology, is that there was the superior god and the lesser gods to do the work. The lesser gods started complaining because, we're sick and tired of doing all this menial labor. What can be done? They went on strike, and okay, what's going to happen? Well, somebody has to do the work. So they get the idea to create creatures to do the work. Who are those creatures? Woohoo! Yes.
Just the males.
In their thinking, human beings were created to be the slaves of the gods, to do the work that the gods didn't want to do themselves. So you can see how that, right from the beginning, their thought of human beings is not, we are created in the image of God who has relationship and who loves and who has authority and who wants to, to share with us. And there's no dignity, there's no value. Humans were created to be slaves. So when you look into the ancient world, slavery was very common. That was just the natural order of things. Obviously, people are created to do the work. And so you have the handful of elites, you have the king and then, his court and whoever's doing the ruling. And then you have all the masses of people who are just living at a subsistence level. And they're there just to do the work. They're there to serve the king and bring all the wealth into his coffers, but they don't get to enjoy it. They're just trying to survive and trying to, hoard a little bit for themselves. So you have the heavenly realm, and it's reflected in the earthly realm. In the earthly realm, there's the king and then everybody underneath him. And in the heavenly realm, there's the superior god and the lesser gods. So I'll just give you a little bit of information just that might be of interest, because in the ancient Mesopotamian world, they have a flood story as well. They also have that idea of a global flood that wiped out humanity, much the same as we have in the Bible, but with some significant changes. The flood in their case, why did the flood come? When you read the biblical account, why does God bring the flood?
he was disgusted with mankind for their sin,
For sin.
except for the 8.
Yeah. It's very key that we understand this. God brings the flood in response to sin. It's not because people are somehow bad in themselves, like there's no worth to them, but they have sinned because they're moral agents. God looks at them as their choices make a difference. Their choices have meaning. And they've consistently chosen to sin. And it gets to the point where God just has enough because their wickedness is so great. So he sends the flood to punish that generation of people. But what happens after the flood?
Sin continued.
But not regarding sin. But, you know, the ark comes to rest on Ararat and the waters go away. And then the people come off the ark. And what does God say to them?
Go forth and multiply.
Yeah, what's that?
Go forth and multiply.
He repeats the original mandate. Back in Genesis, he says, you know, when it's just the two of them, go forth and multiply. When they come down from the ark, he says, go forth and multiply. Why? Because you're humans. And I love you. And I've created this world for you. It's been tainted by sin, but not so much that I'm just going to destroy you forever. I still want you to be here. In the Mesopotamian flood story, the gods send the flood because of overpopulation. Humans go forth and multiply, as we do, and the humans make so much noise that it disturbs the gods' sleep. It bothers them. And so their problem with the humans is that there's just humans, they're nasty, and there's too many of them. So they send famines and they send fires and flood, you know, just all kinds of stuff trying to get rid of them, to bring down the population of the vermin. Until finally they send the flood to, you know, bring the population down. So you can see a contrast. In this pair of spectacles, they're looking out on the world and they're seeing human life has no value. There's no dignity in being a human being. You're just the slave. You're there to do the work. You're there to serve. So consequently, when it comes to how they govern themselves, well, of course they have the king and the ruling elite and all the slaves underneath them. All the people are there to serve. It would never cross their minds that human beings, as a human being, any human being, had value, had dignity, had anything to be proud of. For the most part, you're just a slave, unless you happen to be born into the kingly family. Whereas in the biblical account, with this pair of spectacles, the omnipotent God has created creatures in his image for relationship, and he loves them. And even though they sin and he punishes them, he's still pleased to have human beings, because when they come off the ark, he says, okay, let's try again. He's not disgusted with them. He's grieved by their sin, but he's still happy that we're humans. There's value in human life. Even though it's tainted by sin, it's not destroyed by sin. So there's a value of the human life. And so you can see it in these various cultures. And it's similar in Egyptian culture. They have a similar sort of conception of, the hierarchy of the gods, and the state controls you and most people are slaves, et cetera, et cetera. It's very similar in both of those cultures in the larger ancient world. There's just that concept that humans aren't really that valuable. So you can see how significant it is when the Hebrew nation comes out of Egypt. Like, that is unheard of, that a God would choose a people that are weak and poor and slaves, and he would choose them to be his own, and he would rescue them, like literally, physically rescue them, and bring them to it like, here's a land, you're my people, you're my kingdom of priests, you're my holy nation. I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to give you my laws. I'm going to reveal myself in the fire and the smoke. I'm going to do all of these wonders on your behalf. That was a completely revolutionary idea in the ancient world. The gods don't do that. If they're going to pick somebody They're going to pick, the Pharaoh and his court or whoever. They're not going to pick the slaves because the slaves are vermin and they multiply and they make a mess.
They were God's chosen people before they became slaves.
Yes. Yeah, you can see it all the way through the history. Like even back in the Garden of Eden, you can see even though God punishes them for their sin, but it's like, there's somebody coming, There's that person who's going to come to make things right. You will. I forget the words now. But he's going to crush your head. You'll bruise his heel, but he'll bruise your head. Somebody's coming. A human being is coming, not just some Superman from the gods coming down, but this is a fellow human being is going to do this. And then God goes and he picks. He shows favor to Noah and he shows favor to Abraham and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you and your descendants after you. Like this is the creator God, and he's coming down and he's picking just a nobody. Just Abraham wasn't anybody special. He was one of the masses. And so this God came and picked, and I'm going to make a nation out of you. So yeah, for sure. It's God, he's such a unique God. He's always turning things on our head, but it shows us how far we go in suppressing the truth. It's infiltrated everywhere. And so we have this idea that God is, he's mean and he's an elitist and he's just going to run roughshod, when actually he's very loving and kind, but we suppress the truth and we're in constant rebellion against him. So at any rate, we see the Hebrew God, and he's coming on the scene. He is revealing himself in ways that are just unheard of in the ancient world. And he is showing us, this is what I think of you. You do have value, not because you're anything special, because they've been tainted by sin. Okay, he sent a flood to destroy people because their sin was so bad. So it's not, I haven't chosen you. And he says this to the Israelites, I haven't chosen you because you're more righteous than everybody else. I'm not throwing these people out of the land because you're so good. I'm throwing them out because they're so evil, and you're not much better. So there's never this sense of like, oh, I can really be proud because God has chosen me. It's like, oh, wow, God has chosen me. That's a gift that he's giving to me. So we can see even from ancient times, the uniqueness of the Hebrew God in choosing a nation, in rescuing a nation. When you get to God takes them out of bondage in Egypt, and he brings them just before they get to the promised land, when they go to Mount Sinai, and he gives the law to them. And he establishes a covenant with them. And they get the 10 Commandments and all these sorts of things. The way that is all set up, God is actually imitating a current sort of treaty. Hello.
Sorry for the interruption. There were two ladies.
Come on in.
To join your class.
Sure, there's a couple of seats over there. Come on in. Not a problem, Linnea. God is actually imitating a form of treaty that was already in place in the ancient world at that time, where a superior king, a powerful king, he's here, and then there's a less powerful king, and maybe this nation is being oppressed and needs help. So he would approach this powerful king and ask to have a treaty to be made. And so they would establish this treaty between these two kings, the superior king and the subordinate king. And there would be all sorts of, they would talk about the history of, oh, well, I've done this for you and I've done that for you. And okay, here's what the subordinate king is going to do for the superior king, and all sorts of, they would actually make this treaty and they'd put it inside their temple, and they'd have blessings and cursings and all of that sort of thing. And when you go into Exodus and you read, for example, in Exodus chapter 20, when God gives the 10 Commandments, he follows basically the same sort of treaty. For instance, when you're reading in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So right there, God is taking the role of the superior king and like, this is what I have done for you. And he gives them all of their responsibilities towards him. You shall do this and this and this, and you shall not do this and this and this. Well, that's following that ancient formula for making treaties. And eventually they take the 10 Commandments and they deposit them in the Ark of the Covenant, and it eventually goes into the temple, first the tabernacle and then later on the temple. And again, that's what they would do when these ancient kings were making treaties with one another. This is exactly what they would do. So God is imitating that, but with a few key differences. When the ancient kings were making the treaties, it was just between the powerful king and the less powerful king. It was a direct treaty between them. They're representing the people. But the powerful king here is not interested in all your minions. You know, he's just speaking to the king. He's making the treaty with the lesser king. Whereas when you look at when God is establishing the covenant through Moses and all of that, he's speaking to the people as individuals. He makes the covenant with the nation as like a corporate group. But the way he's speaking, this law, it's not just for Moses, you shall not murder. That's for everyone. You shall not murder. For everyone, don't commit adultery. For everyone, honor your mother and father. That was a unique characteristic. For the ancient kings, this powerful king, he doesn't know you. It's not like Romper Room where she looks through the mirror and I see so and I see you. They didn't see that. That was just the mass of people. But then this God, this superior God, comes down and picks a group of people who are slaves and rescues them and makes a covenant with them, makes a treaty with them, with you and you and you and you. Why? Because you're human beings and you're important. And I want to have a relationship, not just with a bunch of faceless people represented by Moses. And I'll talk to Moses, but the rest of you just go away. Moses, is the mouthpiece, but God is still interested in each person. And the treaty that he makes with them applies to each person. And when you go through the rest of, Exodus and Leviticus, and when they speak, like they have these various festivals where 3 times a year, each of the Hebrew males has to present himself at the tabernacle and later at the temple. Well, that's exactly the formula from these ancient kings. A few times a year, the subordinate king had to go and present himself to the superior king face to face. So then God comes, he establishes this treaty, but it's not just, I just want Moses to come, I just want Joshua to come. He wants everybody. He wants those representatives, and it's with the males. They are representing their families, but he wants each one of them 3 times a year. You have to come and see my face. Now, see the veil, obviously they don't see him literally, but they come to his presence, where his presence is located in the tabernacle. God, he is seeing people as people, and he wants them to come into his presence. So this is just, when the Hebrew God comes on the scene, when he chooses to reveal himself, he reveals himself in a way that just is so revolutionary, because he sees people as individuals and he wants relationship with individuals. This is unheard of in the ancient world. The Hebrew God is different than all the rest of them. And the Israelites so often just don't get it, And they're forever falling into sin, and they're forever, oh no, let's go worship Baal. Baal doesn't care about me, and Baal, doesn't answer my prayers, but he's got a gold statue. Let's go, I can see it, People want to see something, they want to touch something. But we are in rebellion, and we're constantly suppressing the truth. So if we're suppressing the truth, no matter how good this is, no matter how kind, no matter how loving, no matter how many miracles, our nature is to suppress the truth. We just do it because it's rooted. That's sin. We will throw away a vacation at the seaside to go play in mud puddles because that's our mud puddle. And I get to decide how deep I'm going to dig it, That's the tragedy That's the tragedy of sin. And we need to grasp that. But it just shows how wonderful God is. So, whenever you're reading through the Old Testament, or you're tempted, oh, I got to skip through all of this stuff. Don't skip it, you know. This is revolutionary stuff. It's hard for us to grasp because we're living in a different culture, but really, it is revolutionary stuff. So that's one way that we see how the Hebrew God does something different. But another way is that throughout the Old Testament, he's always referring to this marriage covenant, how God is establishing a covenant with Israel, his bride. Now, again, that's also a revolutionary concept. In the ancient world, the god doesn't pick somebody to marry. They had things like temple prostitutes. But it's not like this virgin is coming to the temple to have union with God. She's there to service the patrons that come in there. So there isn't that sense of intimacy and fidelity within, marriage, that sort of marriage. But when the Hebrew God reveals himself, he takes this people as his bride with this sense of love and cherishing and intimacy and of fidelity, which again, this is unheard of in the ancient world. So we can see how this idea of God as a loving being who sees people as individuals, who puts value on them, and who wants relationship with them is becoming clear in the Old Testament. So now we continue on through salvation history and we come to the coming of Christ. Now, I haven't switched my... Oh yeah, there's some Egyptian gods, and what else do we have in there? Oh, there's the Hebrew God. I totally, I put all these things together and then I'm not even scrolling through them. So then we've got, there's Noah. And yes, some various images and whatnot. Marriage. Okay, there we go. I've caught up. So then we come to New Testament times, and the Word becomes flesh. The Word just doesn't stay up there ruling the universe and upholding everything, but the Word comes